Welcome to Unit 4, our final unit for Biology 100. In Unit 4, we move into ecology. We'll talk about what that means in a minute, but basically we are moving away from individual organisms and looking at populations and the environment and how those organisms and populations interact with the environment and interact with each other. So the study of ecology is a really big field within biology, and there are a lot of things that go into it. And the thing that I like about ecology is that we start to see the effects of human interaction, and we start to see the effects of groups of organisms on one another. The other thing I like about this one is we start to see more animals in the PowerPoint. But ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. So there's a definition I wanted to go over that's not on this slide, and that is the definition of an ecosystem. So ecology is the study of ecosystems. And ecosystems are all of the living organisms in a particular area and all of the non-living elements. This can be the water, the air, the terrain, the nutrients in the soil, all of the non-living elements within that particular area. And at the ecosystem level, we are looking at how organisms interact not only with other organisms, but with the non-living elements within that particular area. So we can look at the ecology of individuals, how individuals interact with each other and with their environment. We can look at how populations interact with their environment. We can look at how communities interact. So communities are groups of populations and how they all interact with one another. And then we can study the ecosystem level interactions. So you can see just by looking at the different levels how big the field of ecology is. And of course, you already know that humans have a big impact on individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. So the field of ecology attempts to answer a lot of different questions, starting at the population level. The most basic question we could ask is how many organisms are there? And then we can get into more complicated things like how healthy is the population? How many resources do those populations have? How much population can the environment support? And then we can look at human impacts as well. So we can look at the economic impact that a population of organisms is having on humans and the impact that we are having on those populations. So conservation comes into play in the field of ecology. How can we maintain profits of some of these organisms that we're harvesting, whether it is agricultural or whether it is natural populations such as lobster? And how can we gain the greatest economic profit while also protecting those resources for the future? So if you haven't read it yet, section 16.1 has this fabulous example of lobsters and a brief description of managing that lobster fishing population so that we not only maintain the health of the population, but also have the greatest economic profit from those populations. And it's a really good example of what the study of ecology does. So chapter 16 focuses on population ecology. Now at this point, we should all be familiar with the definition of population. We defined it in both of our evolution chapters. But just as a quick review, a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area and interbreeding. Now, you remember, you can have populations that overlap, you can have populations that are isolated from one another, but the key thing is that they are living together and they are breeding. Now, the ecosystem affects the population, and the populations have effects on the ecosystems. One of the ways that the ecosystem affects population is by limiting population sizes. So we're going to talk about the way that populations grow and the way that ecosystems limit populations from becoming too large. So when resources are plentiful, populations are going to grow quickly. But the ecosystem can't maintain that population growth forever. Now, if you think about it, this is often a really obvious concept to think about because you've probably all noticed it at some point in your life. If you have too many organisms in a particular area, the resources are going to run out. And at some point, those limiting resources are going to cause the population to decline. So one really good example is managing the deer population. Pretty much every state I've ever lived in has to manage a deer population, because if the population gets too big, they're going to end up eating too many resources, and then the population is going to become unhealthy. And so as part of managing that population, there are often hunting regulations that allow for taking a certain number of individuals out of the population as a sort of population control so that the deer are not overstaying their ecosystem. So they're not removing too many resources from their ecosystem. But one of the ways that the ecosystem limits population growth is by limited resources, which causes competition for those resources. And then, of course, if individuals are competing, some are going to compete better than others. That links back to our evolution unit. And some of those individuals are not going to survive, which is going to limit population growth. In a stable population, that's a population that is neither growing nor decreasing. Each individual simply replaces itself. So for every male in the population, they're replaced by one individual. Every female in the population is replaced by one individual. A stable population has one-for-one replacement. One of the most important questions in ecology is how a population is growing or shrinking over time. What is the growth rate of that population? Because the growth rate is going to affect how well the ecosystem or the environment can maintain that population. So the growth rate is the change in the number of individuals in a population over time. So that's what a rate is, right? It's a change over time. So the growth rate is just the change of the number of individuals over a period of time. Usually that time frame is going to be 1 year. Now, if we want to understand how the population is growing, we need to know two things. We need to know what that growth rate is, and we need to know the number of individuals that we have in the population. And from there, we can calculate how quickly or slowly our population is growing. So the growth rate is just going to be the birth rate minus the death rate. So again, this makes sense if you think about what's happening. The growth rate is going to be high if there are more births than there are deaths. The growth rate is going to be low if there are more deaths than there are births. So if there are more individuals dying than are born, the population is not going to grow. The other thing we need to know is the number of individuals. Now you can estimate this or you can directly count. It depends on the population and the information that you have. Lab 14 talks about one method of estimating the number of individuals in a population. For now, we're just going to say we know the number of individuals so that we can work through an example. So the rate or the number of individuals that is going to increase or decrease in the next generation is, or the population growth, the actual number for the new population, is going to be calculated by multiplying the growth rate times the current number of individuals. Now we're going to do some easy math here. It's mostly going to be multiplying and dividing. Actually, that's all it's going to be. But the thing that you need to do, besides keeping track of your multiplication and division, is to memorize what these variables mean. You need to know what R stands for and how you calculate it. You need to know what N stands for and how you get it. So let's calculate the population growth for an imaginary population of 500 individuals. So remember, if we're going to calculate population growth, we need two things. We need the number of individuals in the population, and we need the growth rate. So we've just been given number of individuals. We've been given n, and n is going to equal 500 individuals in our population. The other thing we need to do is to calculate our growth rate, or variable r. So let's say in 1 year, 125 offspring are born and 25 die. So before we even go any further, just think about what's going to happen. You have more births than you have deaths, so the population is going to grow. So to calculate our birth rate, we need to take the number of offspring, 125, and divide it by the number of individuals in the population. So our birth rate is going to be 0.25 births per person. Our death rate is going to be the number of individuals who have died, 25, divided by the number in the population, 500. So our death rate is going to be 0.05 deaths per person. So you can see right there that your birth rate is higher than your death rate. Again, you can reason out that the population should be growing. So to calculate R, we're going to subtract the death rate from the birth rate. So R is going to be equal to 0.25 minus 0.05. So our growth rate is going to be 0.20. Now that means essentially that the population is going to grow by 20%. It means that you are going to have 0.20 individuals per person per year. That means for every one individual, you're going to increase by a 20th of an individual, basically. I know that sounds weird. So for every 5 individuals, your population is going to grow by 1. So we calculated our growth rate. Now we need to figure out how much our population is going to grow. So our population growth, recall, is equal to R times N, or the growth rate times the number of individuals in the population. So our growth rate was 0.20. We're going to multiply that by the number of individuals in our population. And so we're going to add 100 individuals to the population in 1 year. So if we started with 500 individuals, and our population is going to grow by 100 individuals, then our new population is 600. Now you can sort of check to make sure this makes sense. We had 125 births and we had 25 deaths. So that means that if 125 lived and 25 died, we have 100 new individuals in the population. So you can sort of check this, reason it out, make sure that it makes sense. So our new population is going to be 600. So you can see that that has grown. For every 5 individuals, we've added 1. There's our growth rate. Now you can repeat this for each generation, calculating a new birth and death rate, or assume that the growth rate is stable. And if this continues unchecked, your population is going to increase over time. When your population is unchecked, you have something called exponential growth. Now, if you look at our graph here, this is just a exponential growth here. If our y-axis is population size and our x-axis is time, over time, our population is going to grow very, very rapidly. So exponential growth occurs when each individual produces more than replacement numbers. So when each individual reproduces and produces more than one individual to reproduce itself. Now our book has this example of a population of elk in year 1 starting at 500. If that population is unchecked, if it is allowed to continue to grow at more than replacement or stable growth level, stable population level, after 100 years, we're going to have a huge amount of elk in our population. Now the environment cannot sustain that. You know that, I know that. There's only a limited number of resources. So exponential growth cannot last long in nature. At some point, this population is going to reach a point where the environment can no longer sustain it. So exponential growth is a temporary situation for a population until it begins to reach what we call the carrying capacity. We'll talk about that in a minute. Population growth is going to be limited by the population's environment. Now, when population growth is limited by the number of individuals in the population, we call these density-dependent factors. So density-dependent factors are effects of the environment, effects of the ecosystem on the population that are related to how many individuals are present. So density, how many individuals are present in a particular area, dependent factors. So based on population size, these limiting factors begin to affect population growth. So the amount of food in an area is going to decrease as there are more individuals. When you decrease the amount of food, you increase competition for food. There's less food available, and so individuals are competing more heavily for it. As the population begins to increase, you get increased competition over places to live and places to breed. You get increased incidence of disease. You know this from looking at human populations. In more densely populated areas, you have faster spread of disease. It's the same thing for other living organisms. And then as your population size increases, you also have an increased predation risk. Because if there are more individuals available, it's going to be easier for the predators to find them. And there's a higher chance that you are going to be the one to be eaten. Now, of course, as long as there are plentiful amounts of food for the predator population is also going to increase, which is going to increase your predation risk. So let's look at how population growth is affected. So population growth is going to be affected by population density, how many individuals there are in a given area. And when we have increases in population density, we're going to increase the effects of those density-dependent factors. Remember, density-dependent factors are those conditions that limit growth based on the population size. So as the population gets bigger, those factors begin to affect the population more and more. Now, I said a few minutes ago that an environment cannot sustain exponential growth long term. Once the population begins to reach a certain density, the environment is going to limit how many individuals it can sustain. And at some point, we are going to reach the carrying capacity of the environment. The carrying capacity is sort of a ceiling, a maximum number of individuals that the population can support. So carrying capacity is a population number, and it's the maximum number that the environment can sustain. Now, carrying capacity is going to influence how the population grows. So let's look at how carrying capacity affects population growth. So a few minutes ago, we calculated population growth using the idea that the growth rate times the number of individuals will give you the amount of the growth, the number of individuals for each time frame. So the book calls this new factor, we're calculating this carrying capacity, calls this factor the new term. I'm not sure why they don't give it a different name, but they call it the new term. So we are going to use carrying capacity to determine how it affects the rate of population growth. And we're going to do that by looking at the number of individuals that the environment can support compared to the number of individuals that are already there. So we're going to multiply our population growth rate by the effect of carrying capacity. So here's the part where we're doing really simple math, but we've got a lot of variables. So if you don't already have these variables memorized and how you calculate those variables, I would strongly suggest that you make some flashcards. And once you get the variables straight, it's simply plugging in the numbers. So K is carrying capacity. It's a number of individuals, the number of individuals the population, the environment, can support. Remember, N is our number of individuals in the population currently, and R is our growth rate. So let's do an example. So in our earlier example, we had 500 individuals, and we calculated our growth rate as 0.20. If you don't remember how we did that, you might want to pause and go back and check that out. So let's calculate how carrying capacity influences our growth rate. So essentially, we're going to get a new growth rate at the end of all this. So let's just plug in our R and our N values, 0.20 times 500. Let's plug in our new carrying capacity. Let's say that the carrying capacity for the environment is 550. So we're going to plug that in. That means that the highest number of individuals that our environment can support is 550. So if we plug in our numbers, 550 minus our current value, 500, divided by 550. Now before we finish this, let's think about this a little bit. It would appear that we may be approaching carrying capacity. We have 500 individuals presently, and the most we can sustain is 550. So if you think about what should be happening, your population growth rate should be slowing down because you're reaching your carrying capacity. So once we plug in all these numbers and calculate them, our new growth rate is going to be 0.9. So this new growth rate of 0.9 is very close to 1. So essentially what we're doing is we're multiplying our original growth rate by 1, which means it's really not going to change very much. If you multiply any number by 1, it remains the same. So our original growth rate was 0.2. So if we multiply that by 1, our growth rate isn't going to change very much. So our growth rate is not going to change. Our population, I see a typo here. This actually should say population is not growing exponentially. The population is actually slowing down. So let's do another example, different example here. Let's say that in a different population, our carrying capacity is 100,000. And the number of individuals in our population is 99,000. So let's say here that our K value, when we plug in our K value and calculate it out, our new growth rate is 0.01. Now this means that we are close to a 0 population growth rate. 0.01 is very close to 0. This means that population growth is going to be very nearly 0. That means that we are almost at our carrying capacity. So if our new term, as our book calls it, our carrying capacity is close, our carrying capacity growth rate is close to 1, population growth rate is essentially unchanged. That means that the population is nearing carrying capacity. I'm sorry, I'm getting these mixed up. Too many numbers today. If our carrying capacity growth rate is close to 1. That means that our rate is unchanged. And so your population is going to continue to grow at the previous rate. So you're going to have lots of population growth. If the carrying capacity is close to 0, it means the environment is nearly full to capacity, and population growth reduces. So you have very little population growth. So you can sort of think about what's going on here. If your population is already close to carrying capacity, you're not going to grow much. If your population is not at carrying capacity yet, your population is going to grow quickly. So we have two types of population growth models that we can look at. So we've already seen this exponential growth. That's our growth here. This is where, when unchecked, the population can grow unhindered, and it grows very quickly. But in reality, the environment is going to cause a limited number of individuals in that specific area, our carrying capacity. So if we look at the effects of carrying capacity on exponential growth, and you think about what's happening in the population, as this population grows, it's going to start using up resources, and that's going to limit the number of individuals, so that growth is going to slow down, and it slows down as the population begins to reach carrying capacity. This is something called logistic growth, where you start out with exponential and then you slow down. This is often seen as an S-shaped curve on your graph, whereas the exponential growth curve is going to be a J-shaped curve. Logistic growth rate is going to be highest right here in the middle. The population is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which means they're reproducing faster and faster and faster. And so the point between the starting population and where the population begins to level off, halfway between, is going to be the point of the greatest growth in that population. And you can see that here. So growth rate is greatest when we are at half the carrying capacity of the environment. So limited resources are what is going to cause logistic growth. Just as sort of a recap, population growth is going to slow as we begin to reach our carrying capacity. Population growth begins to stabilize. So at this point, we have our stable population. We've got 1-for-1 replacement because of those limited resources. Now, in an ideal situation, your population would show this fantastic, lovely S-shaped curve. But really, in a real population, you are not going to probably see this beautiful S-shaped curve. But the idea is going to be the same in a real population. You're always going to have limited resources. You're always going to have competition for those resources. And so there's always going to be a limit to the number of individuals that that environment can support. So we talked about density dependent factors. Those are factors that keep the population in check based on population size. We also have other things that affect the population numbers of a group of organisms. And so we can also have density independent factors. So these are factors that don't have anything to do with the density of the population, sort of like our genetic drift examples from evolution. These are chance events that affect population sizes, and it doesn't matter how many are there. It's basically what our book calls bad luck events. So these are going to be things like natural disasters, forest fires, droughts, things like that. Things that kill individuals regardless of what they are, who they are, or how many they are. So even if our population is undergoing exponential growth, there might be a density independent factor, a natural disaster of some sort, that results in a huge decline in the population. After that event, the population returns to its exponential growth, and so on. There might be another, a different density independent factor that causes a crash in the population. So real populations are never going to undergo exponential growth for very long, and they're very unlikely to undergo true textbook logistic growth.